Croeso I chi gyd, ffailche o'r Villa. Welcome to one and all. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight Pàdraig MacAoidh, writer, broadcaster, and academic. He was born and brought up in Lewis, on the island of Lewis in the Western Isles. He's lived since then in Barcelona, in Dublin, and presently lives in Edinburgh. He's the author of two collections of poems, Gŵyl and Daw'r, both of which I can highly recommend. And as we welcome you, Pàdraig, let's get the ball rolling with a poem, please.
Diolch, Ifor. And so this poem is Yntitled, or as you'll see in the English translation, The Well. Yntitled. Fi mi chilich gach lag yn topper o'r falle, ach a rhywch yn iawn. Sa acam rhi chrwch eich on fronish scotch is nice is spatch rochlachen. Jamarsh clach mi mask de Lego agus briacan, shili is corduroy. La canille, star in Toledo, panty, fachlanachachol, ichlan garavail. Kanye lanor javska and a chimis nuer and ach ras in the monchi smooth. Skiloch tainch na vloy hagamisha cloen, gach trip, amiga harish.
Thank you. Would it be fair if I asked you where does this particular topper come from?
It comes from other poems. Quite often, I write about my life, I write about my childhood, or write about things that happened, but I often respond to other poems quite often. And there's a famous poem by the Gaelic poet Derek Thompson, and a famous poem by the Irish poet Cathal Sharkey, both called The Well. And both of them play in different ways with the idea of this well of culture that you return to and you heal yourself, or you have this possibility of the pure drop of culture that you can drink up and replenish yourself. And I'm very wary of that. I don't necessarily believe in linguistic or cultural purity. I like the idea of mongrel language and mongrel culture, the way that you can pull different elements from different places and put them together, those Lego bricks along with the grey dock feathers, say. And you have to create your own well. You have to create your own sources of energy, being fully respectful to those that exist already, but you also have to create your own ways of looking at the world or trying to shape the world.
And there's a part of the way you've shaped your word, obviously, is between Gaelic and Scots. There's a word in the translation that may be unfamiliar to some of our viewers this evening, skelfs.
Skelfs are great words. It's almost onomatopoeic. A skelf is the bit of wood, a splinter that you get under the skin, and you can just imagine it going in there. And so the kiss sound is like a cutting into your hand. So a splinter of wood, a splinter of pottery in this case.
You use the word mongrel there. Is that a word that might be used to describe your upbringing in some ways, perhaps?
You could do it. I think the more standard way is saying bilingual, but I think there's similar ways of looking at it. And I was raised from a.
It to sound so pejorative.
I don't think it's pejorative at all. Every animal I've ever owned, apart from a couple of collies, has been mongrel. But I grew up from a young age with both Gaelic and English before I went to school, and so both of them are mother tongues, and we're involved in this project, as you well know, Ifor, about mother tongues and about how that affects poetry and what the concept of mother tongue might be. But for me, I lost Gaelic largely when I went to school, because on the Isle of Lewis, when I was of school age, and still now, there was very rarely primary school education through the medium of Gaelic, even though it is a Gaelic heartland, one of the main places where it still survives. And so through my primary education, I was taught in English. Secondary school, I had some schooling in Gaelic, but there's always been the sense of having to try and retrieve it from somewhere. And this idea of going back to the well, it would be lovely if the well was there, where you could just go and drink the pure Gaelic from it that comes down through the ages. But it's this need to try and reclaim something that you're creating at the same time.
Yes. Well, sidestepping for the present the somewhat surprising revelation that English is still the main medium of primary education in a Gaelic heartland. If we move on, the retrieval of a Gaelic identity, if you like, a Gaelic identity mediated through language. You've written in something you shared with me about where anthropology and journalism fuse together, and I understand that it was in fact something you were, as children, you were sent out to record your elders. So that even though you were being educated perhaps mainly through the medium of English, Gaelic heritage was prized to the extent that you were sent out to become anthropologists, as it were.
I think this was one of the odd things. Although the official schooling was through English, and that is about to change, so that by default will be Gaelic. The teachers I had were all Gaelic speakers, and they all understood the value of the culture and the value of passing it on and recording it. And so I remember as a primary school kid being sent out with a little tape recorder to record the old people in the village to get their stories. And I think it was a fantastic idea because it was company for everybody. But it was also, you were likely to get different stories if you were telling them to a young child than if you were telling them to a visiting anthropologist, say.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes out of it is that from a young age, we were almost trained to be looking at our culture as something it was our job to record. Not just to celebrate, but to physically record. And then there's this strange passage of many people my age who now work for the BBC or are journalists or who are radio or TV producers. And there's this ongoing archiving, celebration of the culture that I'm slightly wary of again, just because I don't know, I'm wary or interested in the relationship between the archive and the living culture and where one might outweigh the other. But I think there's something very interesting in the way that we were encouraged to be thinking of ourselves in this way.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, you spent a period of time working in broadcast journalism yourself.
Yes, not quite as long as you, I don't think, but I was a broadcast journalist for BBC Arall and BBC Radio and Gŵyl for a couple of years, and then also a news producer, just in the gallery, pressing the buttons, making sure that we didn't overrun, these kind of things. And it was a fantastic experience, partly because the job I had as a journalist was primarily international news. And so it was trying to find vocabulary and ways of mapping what was happening in the Middle East or in Libya or in the United States into Gaelic, finding new phrases, new language, but also trying to find people who could talk to these stories. And one of the fascinating things about this was how, as a news service, it developed almost a form of citizen journalism. And so you knew that there would be a Gaelic speaker in Australia or New Zealand who you would phone up, and they're not a journalist, they're not an expert. You don't expect them to have access to the Prime Minister. And so you're engaging with stories in a different way. You are saying, okay, what's happening on the TV? What are you being told? How does it feel to be alive in that moment? And in some ways, again, this was much more anthropological than journalistic. It was talking to people as human beings rather than as subjects or objects of news stories.
Yeah, well, that is a characteristic that is shared by international Welsh journalism, if we may dignify it with such a name. But it's, it does bring its own colour and its own perspective, and in truth, somebody who lives in a country where there's a breaking news story has in some ways has just as much right to comment on it as a journalist who flies in on a plane and stands in front of the building where it happens and then starts to declaim, what he's heard, because he's just a more sophisticated observer, really. Anyway, you were involved in video production at that time. We've been working together with Siwrne of Ireland to produce a body of work that we initially hoped we would be able to tour live, but now will take the form of 3 videos each, discussing different aspects of mother tongue, as you referred to it earlier. Before we move on from that, is there any way that your experiences as a broadcaster, as a journalist, impacted on your writing at all?
Yes, and I'm not sure how positive they were sometimes, because they're entirely different medium. You're using the language in very different ways. And so particularly, say, when talking to video, you're wanting to pare the language right back down to allow the images to speak as much as possible. And your voiceovers or the whatever words you're using in some ways have to be secondary, or they're picking out details, or they're shaping the way that your eyes are following the pictures. And it means that you are a lot sparser in your speech. You're a lot less over the top. You're a lot less effusive. It was a great skill to learn, but it meant it was very difficult at times, if I was wanting to write a poem, to use adjectives, or to use any form of description, because that's there already. And so in some ways I had to retrain myself to create worlds through words, without having the ability to rely on the images to be doing much of the work.
Yeah, the pictures are your adjectives. The sounds are your adverbs. So you have to work within those different rhythms and syncopate it accordingly. Well, I think it's time for another poem, Peter.
Yes,
I'm calling you Peter, right? I need to explain this. Pàdraig MacAoidh is your writing name, your Gaelic name, but you also go by the academic moniker of Peter MacAoidh.
Well, and again, I was brought up with both names, but on my passport, on all of my official documentation, it's the English name, Peter MacAoidh. And that's still very common in Scotland, that you will have your Gaelic name is in some ways unofficial. It is slightly subversive. It's the one that you do for creative things, and then you revert to the English to appear in court or whatever it's going to be. And so I think we have this useful, or it's common to have this useful double personality or double way of engaging with the world.
Indeed. Well, I wasn't born Ifor ap Glyn either, so we have that much in common. So let's have another poem, please.
Yes, and so this poem is very much connected to what we've been talking about, the capturing or recording of a culture, and what that means, what it means when you have all of these voices recorded and the words that will continue beyond any of our lives. And also, the longer since I was a journalist, the longer my poems get as well. So this is a relatively long one. There are many more words than I'd ever be allowed to get away with on a video pack. This is Bielarish. Nuair is táit na clárich, lenus orste brian mu yachtri nach ro fickerach as an clóis an clunne. When a daltach in a hanig an dillin san darna chokich, nes eich bolach na heilig tu. Aploch, gioloch. When trip a hásig an nuclos fat a lawer chans na seach tjungen. Ach a hain is paing for yead der paste, skajach se verras a richt. Mijn eileer, as gonna fi brian mijn eileer. We vier de naker in der kool of groef wat te wehe, a vaantjoch a traai och klapper. Maar va kunnersjoch a klanie in de vier meer vaantjoch na nener. We god giolte, snes missen of a iets doel like de va behe fi continue. Mijn dooi a vok teprenen, gus de graas a fulke, gus de chemmenen uurkoch en traai a vlieg. Agus fiús nar a faction ar nóach gur fallach was héis gan na bunscotchen, na collection, na studioin agus gasin is agus post agus maraf mar a hain, na nóirse brian. Baclan na septic gan sa flywood agus an stúr arnish, sna hanti ma casars. Gyda fa jéidig fúntir is fatar o vacutan is iarnach dje misk na chnoch an jamen, an an drar an nach jéidig gloch y bra, lech gan jach da rhif gan nŵr a fósú. Chálar se choncaigh górste, an pres ó chhlach gan na scoileí an trans von talú, papar balla brech le taseach chus lepanan agus séirichan agus scahan an risin a chuhann sibh skilin in is nátachan, u jólan sibh harris ar bhaint agus stórnavach, as a iach sy'n ffri mi arst agos crinach, gos medych gos spatan chicar, gach bloi, gos bavach mi erich, ys hwn ag ar y cloicha, hwrs of hein mae ilip, clanyan yn sgan ach o jawr o'ch ysgrifchys fa rif, dors mil ymach sawl gan yw'r treifche. Faclan ham nes y gwmlwch ag sy'n pwlwch ag hele, y cyr crith cys sy'n gan afwch y dŵr to, os y prwmwthol, agos mae erich hawl y drwy nŵr, os y mach, gos drift ag y gyn y machrach, y cant yn y hacri ra, dydy, gos yn brisio la, mae dda dde sioch yr y prwa, ag un o trach y misg na lilian.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. You referred in the poem to the Eulera, the Aeleg, which I believe is a Gaelic word for an eagle, but it refers to a boat. Tell us about that.
The Aeleg was a boat that was it was a yacht, an Admiralty yacht that was commissioned to take men from Lewis, some from Harris, but largely from Lewis, back at the end of the First World War. And on the night of Hogmanay, 31st of December 1918, going into the 1st of January 1919, it sank just off the coast of Stornoway, with 215 men lost. And what you had then was this absolute sense of tragedy, of loss across the island. This party had been being held, the assumption that all of these men that had come through the war were about to return home. And they didn't, and their bodies washed up on the shore. And this cast a very, very long shadow over Lewis. There were, in the years that followed, large-scale emigration to North America, to Canada and the United States. And partly I think that was because the heart had been torn out of so many villages. There wasn't a village that was unaffected. There was barely a family that was unaffected on the islands. And it was, in some ways, this sense of the horrible, almost divine punishment that this could be, that what role could God have in this tragedy? Then there was this challenge of people's faith. And basically for at least one generation, the Aeleg was a presence, if not for two. And even until the 1970s and 1980s, it was relatively common to see women, especially, still dressed in mourning clothes, dressed all in black from the tragedy.
As you say, a challenge to their faith, but you invert well, not invert. You use a biblical reference, or perhaps play with that at the end of the poem, don't you?
I am not a man of God, shall we say this? I am not a believer in an interventionist God. And one of the things that always interests me is how great a resource religious vocabulary is, how important it is to
Indeed.
Gaelic culture and to Welsh culture as well, I understand. And so if we want to talk about philosophy, if we want to talk about anything that is intellectually challenging, it is the vocabulary of religion that we turn to. But I think there are some really interesting oddities with that. The most common epitaph in Gaelic, or one of the most common epitaphs, is the phrase that I use in the poem, Gus an Brishin La, until the break of day. And this can be read as referring to Judgment Day, and so until day breaks and we are all together again in a promised land. But it actually comes from the Song of Solomon, from the Song of Songs, and describes a lover's tryst. Gus an Brishin La, gus teich na scalan, until the day breaks and the clouds pass away, and we will be like two young roe deer in the meadow. Yeah. And there's something lovely for me that in the midst of death and commemoration of previous generations around the Highlands, you actually also have the celebration of love.
Yeah, that's a wonderful image. It's a wonderful image. Well, to change gear a little, you're a multilinguist. You have Spanish, you have Danish, you have, of course, Gaelic and English, and also Irish from your time spent in teaching in Dublin and in Belfast. Tell us a bit more about the interchange between Irish and Gaelic, as somebody once famously said, or infamously said, what's the difference between Irish and Gaelic? About 400 words. I think they're probably overstating the case a little bit, but certainly there's potential for interplay, for cross-pollination to an extent that we perhaps don't enjoy with our nearest linguistic neighbours in Brittany and in Cornwall.
I think it's been described to me not just a difference of 400 words, but it's a 2-pint language, that after 2 pints you can understand each other perfectly, any more or less, and there's confusion there. But I think one of the crucial things is we're still close enough in time that we've got a very largely shared vocabulary that we can draw upon. Unfortunately, as languages evolve, the bits that aren't shared are the bits that are in most common use, because the more you use something, the more quickly it changes. And so in some ways, it's easier to be talking about religion or philosophy or the meaning of life than it is to be talking about gossip or about what's happening around you on a daily basis. But I think one of the crucial things is that up until about 400 years ago, there was a shared classical Gaelic that you could write in if you had the training, but the vernacular language has diverged since then. And one of the useful things on both sides of the Straits of Moyle is that there are different ethnic or religious associations with each of the languages. And so in Scotland, Scottish Gaelic is strongest in the Western Isles of Scotland, which are split Protestant and Catholic. And so you have many, many Protestants who speak the language, which when you then transplant that to Northern Ireland is reassuring to many people. And it allows access to this shared culture in a way where Irish has, for obvious reasons in the last 40, 50 years, been seen to belong to one community but not another.
No, interesting. If Irish is a 2-pint language for you, I wonder how much you need to drink to understand Welsh.
I'm going to have to come and see. I'm going to have to try it out in a series of pubs. Yeah, when this is all over and when pubs are something one does again.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Is there enough dialogue, do you think, between Irish and Gaelic at the literary level?
I think that it's erratic, and a huge amount depends on the energy and time of very few individuals. And so from the 1970s onwards, there was a Bardic Circuit in which every year poets from Scotland would go over to Ireland and vice versa and be taken around the Gaeltacht areas in Ireland and around the Highlands of Scotland. And this was hugely important for actually creating personal. But there were 3 or 4 people who were responsible for that. And as they aged, and then unfortunately as they passed, those ties depend on other people taking on the mantle. And so we have a lot of translation between Scottish and Irish Gaelic, but much of that is done by 2 or 3 people. And if they don't have the energy or the time, or they have other commitments or interests as they should do, then these bridges can easily become less used. They can become less walked. However, they're there, and there's strong institutional support, there's strong funding for these connections. There's just enough understanding between the 2 languages that there are still all of these shared projects. There should be so much more with Welsh, though, as well. And I think one of the interesting things working, the pair of us with Ciara and Ie, is that Welsh is quite often left out of these conversations between Scotland and Ireland. And I think it's a little bit of laziness on our parts. But it's also, I think, that we don't quite know what to do with each other. And we don't want to, in this way, in this very polite way, we don't want to be the one who goes into the room and makes the conversation us here switch into English, because we know how dangerous that can be for any cultural space. But we have to find ways where we can actually have the conversation.
Well, indeed, and that's one of the things that I hope will follow on from the project we're currently working on. And let us not forget that there is a body of Gaelic poetry available in Welsh, almost all of it translated by one man, the late John Stoddart. There's a collection of classical Awen a Gael, classical Gaelic poetry from, I think, 1450 to 1914, and then, what's the name of the other book? But a collection of more recent poems. So, maybe this is something we can look at. There are precedents, and I hope we'll be able to engage to produce a Gaelic Welsh dialogue in the future.
And there are definitely relationships at university level, and so Celtic departments will teach Welsh, and they will encourage their students to. But I think it would be much better if it happened in the less formal venues as well, or in the less reified academic venues as well, finding ways to put people on stage together, or to have them sat around the table talking.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's important that it's important for both cultures that we have our own windows on the world, and these windows don't have to be glazed with necessarily with English glass. They can be glazed with Welsh and with Gaelic. Well, I'm not sure if that leads us on in a sensible way to the last poem you're going to share with us, which doesn't involve glass at all, but fishing as a gilly. And I believe you have some personal experience of working as a gilly.
Yes, I think probably the way to look at it is the poem is largely about English in some ways as well, and it's about what kind of role you have as a speaker of a minority language surrounded by English. So my first job was as a gilly on a salmon fishing estate, the Grimmerstraw estate on the Isle of Lewis. Very, very good fishing, usually. Except the year that I was there, I worked for 10 weeks, and nobody caught any salmon at all. And they were spending thousands of pounds a week to come up to Lewis and to sit in the pouring rain with no fish. I think the poachers had a fantastic summer, but the fishing was terrible. I was the only Gaelic speaker who was employed there, and I was 17 at the time, and I was a bit raw. And this was the first time, to be honest, I saw or encountered the full force of the British class system. Because it was a fishing estate, it was quite often bankers from Edinburgh, from London coming down, minor aristocrats coming, and they've been coming for years. And my role there was very much, because I knew nothing about fishing, I was fit enough to row a boat, but I couldn't give advice. My role there was to give local colour. It was to give the few words, to talk about the place names nearby, to give a hint of a song perhaps. And I didn't know the part of the island very well, so I ended up making almost everything up. If they had to ask what the name of that hill was, well, on the maps they say one thing, but this is what we call it. And as you'll see in the translation that'll be there or somewhere, it rhymes surprisingly well in the English because there's enough difference between the Gaelic and the English. I'm a slightly dishonest translator, but this is a poem about translating slightly dishonestly in a way. Gilly. There are rachashin len the banker and the muir vanchich, via mit a Gŵyl in an outboard, vies na huamach. Chosach a hiad bacan na yerich, a brian go hiesal mu arakat, mun vies a bjars an Grimmerstraw, rutan nach bi clú gur lehed se. As nur a whippen kulak an fer uwak an noilishkan an siet gan mi hiddikas chjopan, va dol tostoch feitjen. Had dúirsin iascaibh. Cushin each and starnach ons gach culiac, is cach dáran in the raibh, vuoramid gach glumach. Snur gainig yet go bracal, anam nam bjaunt an hawl, ruckershin bain damage ochker, chunga eirig frack hawl.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that brings our session to a close. Gŵyl and Nadir, which are both the Gaelic poems appear with the English translations in parallel text. I would heartily recommend them to all our listeners. They can be ordered from Palace Print, and I think there will be details appearing on a slide at the end. It just remains for me to say, Pàdraig, tapaliat, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr, Ifor.
Thank you all for listening.